elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
We have a topic that I think couldn't be more timely than the one we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about the importance of learning from your opponent's playbook. And Connor, maybe I could ask you to flesh that out for us a little bit. Playbook. Our opponents have playbooks?
I think many people who we would consider opponents in this ideological battle are operating from a playbook. And I think far beyond that, many people are finding themselves subject to others who are calling those plays. Right? So you're on the football field and you've got a coach and the quarterback, and ideally, they have a team that's very coordinated. But I think what you find in the public realm is that there are a few key people that are operating by this playbook. And then just like Edward Bernays said in the book Propaganda that we've talked about in a past episode, they become almost like puppeteers, that they're kind of manipulating and controlling other people. That's this kind of invisible government is what he called it a century ago. And I think that's more often what you find. There are many people who are sincere or who are ignorant, who are not necessarily our strategic opponents, who are not necessarily operating from a playbook. But I think it's important to understand what is in that playbook and what some of the tactics are, because if we want to win, or at least if we want to lose not as badly, we have to have counter strategy as well.
Okay, so in a sense, I'm going to use kind of a chess analogy. When we are engaged in ideological, I'm going to call it conflict because warfare just sounds way too intense. But
right.
when we're trying to win someone over to a particular point of view, or persuade them that this is a better way, or this is a better ideal, we can expect that there will be counter moves that others will make who don't support that point of view. And I guess that's our focus today is learning a little bit about why they have playbooks, what those likely counters are that we're going to run into, and ways that we can know that we're on solid ground when it comes to trying to persuade people to what we hope to persuade them to.
And it's a sad state of affairs that we have to do this at all. Like you would think, oh, well, who cares what other people believe? Let them believe whatever they want. But we find ourselves in a system of government that is majoritarian in nature. And by that, I mean majority rule. And so you find yourself, like Lysander Spooner said, almost defensively engaging in the political process to try and minimize the harm that comes upon you. You can't just live and let live when this system of predation, a predator, is being exploited by other people. And so you find yourself almost compelled to engage in that process to try and, as you said, persuade other people, not for their own satisfaction. We're not trying to, yeah, sure, like these principles can help people live their lives and be a better parent, a better spouse, a better person, no doubt. But I think the reason why we are so heavily engaged in this process is because of that defensive strategy. We're trying to educate other people to get them to leave us alone, right? To respect our life, liberty, and property. And unless you have a majority or plurality or close thereto of people who understand as you do and are willing to ensure that they don't support certain tax policies or certain regulations or elect certain people, we're going to find ourselves losing the freedoms that we cherish. And so we have to learn from the enemy's playbook and their strategies. First, I think, at least to be aware of them. You can't win a war that you don't know is even happening. This is a point that I make in Feardom. Too often people don't understand that there is this ideological war. It is a battlefield, whether we like it or not. And if we don't understand this battle is even being fought, we're going to lose. And so first thing I think is to understand that there are these strategic opponents out there who are very intentionally trying to manipulate people, win people over so that they have the majority, so that they can do as they wish, so that they control the state. So the first thing is we have to understand this is even happening at all.
I want to throw the word allegiance in here because I think it plays into the broader discussion that we're having. Every commercial you see, every billboard you pass, everything you hear on the radio, everything you see on TV, the things you read, in some way is competing for your allegiance. And as long as you recognize that, it's a lot easier to understand that you can own your own point of view. You can choose where your allegiance goes. Some people are very effective at manipulating our allegiance, through shame or fear or self-doubt or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. But as long as you recognize much of life is kind of a tug of war over your allegiance, when you realize that that's the case, then you can approach whatever point of view is being promoted to you with the understanding that, okay, they're asking for my allegiance in some way, shape, or form, but I ultimately get to choose whether or not I give it.
I think the allegiance issue dovetails with one of these strategies that we're talking about in this playbook, and that is identity politics, political persuasion through affinity. People who are like you. Hey, I'm a black congresswoman, so I'm going to have the black vote or the female vote. Or hey, I'm Barack Obama. I'm hip and I'm cool, and so all you people who like hip and cool things, you're going to want to be on my side. Hey, I'm Bernie Sanders, right? I'm even though I have multiple homes and very
I'm for the little guy,
right? I'm for the little guy, and I've been a rebel for decades, and so all you people who want to rebel against the status quo, inherently you're going to be with me, and it gets people to focus on the superficial while setting aside the substantive. People, and let's be clear, like even on all sides of this issue, you see it on the right as well. Well, I'm an evangelical Christian, and so clearly you must all agree with me. Or even you had, probably certain elements within even the Ron Paul movement years ago who were attracted to this guy and maybe didn't understand the underlying principles. And so to some degree you could say, well, that's okay as kind of a foot in the door. But to the extent that we leave it at that as just identity politics, and people are exploiting that system of persuasion and not getting into the more substantive ideas and not talking about policy or principles, I think that's a problem. And so if we are going to understand that the so-called enemy is using identity politics, one question for us is, well, is it appropriate ever for us to use the same? Do we ever want to engage in that where we're trying to win people's allegiance over, at least initially, through an identity that we share or an affinity that we have, and then use that as kind of building on a common ground that we can then educate them and go from there? I'll be very frank. I do this, right? So I'm a Christian. I'm Mormon, actually. And so I'll go out to fellow Mormons and I will use our common language as a way to kind of build that common trust. I'll share a scripture or whatever, right? And I'll build upon that to take them down to deeper things and have that common foundation. My first book I wrote was Why Mormons Should Be Libertarian. Like, I do think that people who share my identity should then come over to, my side, quote unquote. So I think it's not inherently problematic. And perhaps this is kind of something to color the whole discussion with, is these strategies are almost inert in a way. Like, they can be used for good and for bad. It's the force, right?
That makes sense.
It depends a lot on how you use it.
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that that attempt to win your allegiance is bad or manipulative, just from the get-go. It's not. Sometimes it's very good, to have your allegiance won to something that is good and ennobling. And I think we can all think of things that were better for having given our allegiance to. But there are a lot of ideas out there in the world that have brought misery and suffering. And these are the ideas that we're trying to help you recognize, that you've got to know what the opponent's playbook is so that you can better recognize those bad ideas or those flawed ideas when you see them, and then hopefully have the knowledge base and the depth to counter them.
One thing that's coming to mind right now, this may take a moment to try and fully convey what I mean here. I think of the Revolutionary War back in the day when, a gentleman's war was waged in a very distinct fashion, and you'd have the battle lines advance against one another. And you always watch these movies of the Revolutionary War or other ancient wars, and you're like, you guys are idiots. Why are you just standing there while people shoot at you and then wait your turn, right, to fire back? Like, that makes no sense. But that was kind of the culture and the ethos and the strategy of the day. And I think in a lot of ways, those of us who consider ourselves more principled and understanding the principles of liberty, we are waging war much like they did. We have these rules that we're following. We have our ethics. We have our standards. And that is how we're going to do it. Whereas on the other side, you see these guerrilla warfare tactics almost. Back in the day, it was these, colonists who'd hide behind trees and, shoot at soldiers and stuff. And obviously that side was the right side of the war. And so I'm not meaning to suggest that we're all, political redcoats, those of us who now believe in freedom, only to suggest that by limiting ourselves to doing what we think is moral and proper, it's almost like we are restricting ourselves on this ideological battlefield, whereas our enemies, so-called, have no compunction about doing whatever's necessary. For example, as we're talking about the enemy's playbook here, it's only appropriate that I read from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And for those of you who don't know him, I mean, during the whole Obama years, I'm sure you heard Saul Alinsky's name being thrown out as kind of the ideological mentor of Obama. You can go look him up online. But this is what he said. This is a book all about, this is a playbook. This is the playbook of the left. This is about tactics to use to rebel, to change. And here's what he says in a chapter called Of Means and Ends. He says, the practical revolutionary will understand Goethe's, quote, conscience is the virtue of observers and not of agents of action, end quote. In action, Alinsky continues, one does not always enjoy the luxury of a decision that is consistent both with one's individual conscience and the good of mankind. The choice must always be for the latter. Action is for mass salvation and not for the individual's personal salvation. He who sacrifices the mass good for his personal conscience has a peculiar conception of personal salvation. He doesn't care enough for people to be corrupted for them.
Wow.
Right. And so here you say, okay, well, the playbook of the so-called left is outright saying suppress your conscience in pursuit of the greater good, whatever that means to you. Right, because this concept of, general welfare and so forth is abstract and takes on different meaning for different people. But here he's saying, no, you're going to engage in this battlefield. You're going to have to do things that violate your conscience, but that's okay because you always have to be sacrificing your conscience for the greater good. And, death by 1,000 paper cuts here. Pretty soon you end up doing all sorts of horrible things in the name of the greater good, completely disconnected from any sense of morality and conscience.
Is that not, though, what some of the people who did the bidding of the most despotic rulers that humanity can think of? People think about, Hitler's always the one who comes to mind. Hitler was the worst human being ever because he did this and he did that. Technically, there was very little he did personally. He gave commands and he devised plans and ideas and orders, but it was the obedient people who dulled their conscience and went ahead and did whatever it was they were asked to do for the greater good, They were told. Those were the ones who actually enabled the bad stuff to happen.
And I don't know that this is something that we replicate, something that we say, well, oh, hey, our opponents are doing this, so let's do it too, right? And this is what I mean when I say we are kind of the old school warfare folks who have these rules, like we follow our conscience. We're going to do what is moral. And so we're fighting this war with a hand, tied behind our back while the enemy is, exploiting and strategizing and guerrilla warring and all these tactics that deviate from what we would think is proper. So almost from that sense, we're on unequal playing field because they're using tactics that we consider beneath ourselves.
I wonder if you hear this as much as I hear it, because obviously the left takes Saul Alinsky's counsel to heart, and you will see them doing whatever it takes. In fact, I believe there's a group today that is part of some of the violence that we're seeing in public that goes by the name By Any Means Necessary, and they mean it, by any means necessary. They'll do whatever it takes. And I've heard a number of people on the polar opposite side, the conservative or political right, say we need to be more like them. We need to be willing to discard the rules when it suits us. And I find it troubling when people say that. Do you ever hear that, Connor?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do hear that, and I think that that's problematic. It gets to exactly what I'm saying, that hey, the pig is wallowing in the mud, so we have to do it too, and I get it, right? It's tempting. It makes sense strategically. Again, if you're the Brits and you see all these people hiding behind trees, it makes zero sense to stand out in an open field in a big line with a target on your back. And so I get the desire to do as they do. And again, that's why we're on an unequal playing field. If anything, I think that means we need to be more strategic and tactical within our sphere of morality rather than standing in a big open line. And that's where I think we can learn from some of these tactics. So let me share an example. For many years, I was turned off by the emotionalism of statism. People, especially on the left, but also on the right, especially those who cover themselves in stars and stripes and so forth, who would use emotion-inducing arguments as a way to win people over. There was so much emotion, and there is, right? Like, oh, Johnny has a pre-existing condition and he's going to die in the streets if we don't pass single-payer health care, right? Like these stories that were exploited for the benefit of a greater policy. And it was a big turnoff because, we have principles and we have ideas and, whatever. Here's these thinkers. And I was turned off by it. But then I came to the realization in our work here at Libertas that emotions are powerful because they get people to overcome their biases, to overcome the status quo. And we can do that in a principled way. We can use emotionalism. We can use stories as a vehicle to get people to overcome their, tear down their wall that will allow them to reconsider their decision. And so we can share an example of Michael Morton in Texas, who was sentenced to life without parole for, he was in prison for over 20 years for murdering his wife when he didn't, in fact, murder his wife. The prosecutor had hidden or refused to disclose exculpatory evidence that had DNA that showed it was somebody else. This man was in prison for over 2 decades. Had it been a death penalty case, as is common in Texas, he could have been killed. And in fact, you find many, many people being executed by the state who were in fact innocent. There's the Innocence Project, which is fantastic, exonerating people primarily using DNA evidence. These stories are horrific. You can share the stories of Michael Morton and the injustice that people inherently feel. How would you feel in his shoes? And the stories that you can share, for example, as I just did, to get people to reconsider, we got to kill him, string him up in the public square, right? Whoa, wait a minute, right? And rather than citing statistics that, 14% of people are actually innocent, like whatever, that doesn't move people. That doesn't change. Writing a white paper about it, some 80-page treatise on capital punishment, ain't no one going to read that, right? And so stories can be effective to deliver a message that people would not otherwise be willing to hear. That is where I think we can learn from our opponents who have been using storytelling and emotions very effectively for the wrong reasons, I would argue. But I have found great success, for example, here in extremely conservative Utah where we work, in totally shifting the needle on medical cannabis, which we're in the process of trying to legalize and going to get pretty close here. And the reason why conservative Utah, anti-drug, pseudo-moralistic Mormon Utah has now gotten to the point where over 75% of the public supports it is because for several years we have been sharing stories of suffering, stories of harm, the harm that government has been creating. And when we share those stories and evoke those emotions, we can steer people towards the correct path. So that is one where I've become convinced we have to engage in the battlefield. We talk about we're trying to win the hearts and minds, but too often I think people in the freedom movement are just speaking to people's minds in a very academic sense. And I can't tell you how much that is only preaching to the choir. Giving people factoids and data points and arguments will help bolster the arguing ability of people who already agree with you. But if we want to grow this tent and bring people into our cause, you have to speak to people's hearts as well. And we've not been doing too good a job at that, and I think we have to focus on that more.
So here's the distinction that I see you describing. Emotion can be used to whip up a lynch mob. In fact, that's exactly what it's used to. Who cares what the facts are? A wrong's been done, and justice is going to be done with this rope and that there tree. So that's one use of emotion to achieve a desired outcome. But what you're talking about is emotion being used to open people up to a principle that's at stake. And that's where I would say, it can tip people over who weren't on that side of the argument previously. But what's the end result? Are you using emotion to persuade people that, hey, we need to use government force against this group or that person, or, in some way we have to force somebody to do something? No. In the case of medical cannabis, you're talking about we need to stop using government force against real people who are suffering and could be helped by a plant.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, these stories are all about suffering. Whether it's little Johnny who has a pre-existing condition, like that's a problem. Of course, rather than the default of charity care and fraternal organizations and churches or whatever, they use that suffering to say there ought to be a law, right? There ought to be a program. But all they're doing is they're pointing out a perceived problem. We're doing the same, right? We're pointing out a perceived problem. We're pointing out harm. Only in this case, it's not happenstance. It's not some person's random condition or circumstance of life. It is harm that is directly created by the state, by government policy. But in the end, it's the same. You're pointing out problems and pointing people towards solutions. And the solutions, as you know, are radically different. There's a kind of a pivot off of this idea of emotionalism that I want to touch on before we conclude, and that is humanizing policy. The left has been really good about not talking about abstract ideas and policies, but talking about people. Because at the end of the day, policy is about people. Principles are about people. Laws are about people. And I've encountered this so many times, I'm sure you have as well, where the conversation is always people-centric. It's never, let's talk about this policy in the abstract. It's, let's talk about the people who are suffering, using emotional stories. Let's talk about the people who are affected by this. Let's talk about the people in my town that I represent, It's always about the people. And nowhere have I seen this work more effectively and more quickly than in the LGBT movement. If you look at the past few years, the path to so-called quote-unquote marriage equality and all these LGBT workplace discrimination protections and this kind of broader tent of LGBT policy, and maybe it's not LGBT anymore. There's like 40 letters
there's a few more,
in the acronym.
A few more letters
so
that go.
Forgive me for violating anyone's safe space and not correctly getting all the letters. The change has been so quick, I believe, because the LGBT movement recognized that they needed to humanize the issue. And by that I mean come out of the closet. It couldn't be, gay rights. It had to be my friend Billy. It couldn't be the LGBT movement. It had to be, my coworker Sue. And because many people started actively, quote, coming out of the closet, and by that I mean simply sharing their identity, their story, their suffering, their experience, pretty soon, very quickly, everyone knew or knew of someone who was gay. Everyone had an uncle or a brother or a guy down the road or a coworker. And when the policies were being discussed and when they were using the media and doing the marches and everything else, people connected that issue to someone they knew. It humanized the issue for a lot of people. And it led a lot of people to say, well, yeah, no, I really like Bill. He ought to be able to, marry whoever he wants. And it wasn't this abstract policy question anymore. It wasn't a question of principle. It was a question of the guy that I know. And it turned the tides of American public opinion so quickly. That is something I think we can learn from as well. Because if we stay in our ivory towers, if we stay at the 10,000-foot abstract level talking about principles and policies, people aren't going to connect our ideas to their lives and their experiences in the same way.
Let me give one more quick example here, and this is just breaking it down to an individual level. Right now, there is a hyper-awareness of racism, and in fact, it's our society apparently is drowning in racism, depending on who you listen to. And so there's a very loud public contest about how do we combat this? And there are those who think violence in the streets is the answer. There are those who think just loud denunciations at every opportunity are the answer. A guy by the name of Daryl Davis, he's a blues musician. He's a black man. He has persuaded 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan to leave the Klan.
Wow.
You know how he did it?
No.
He became their friends. One at a time, he became friends with these guys. And simply by knowing him, humanizing him, these individuals, 200 of them, came to the conclusion, I can't continue on like this because I know you and I cannot hate you.
Wow.
Isn't that a powerful lesson?
That is powerful. And our challenge, I think, is to scale that. Because if it's a one by one by one, that's tough. And if you look at the LGBT movement, there were so many people who identify as LGBT that as they individually in their spheres of influence started coming out, that exact effect happened. It wasn't one person, it was many people. And so as we look at the individual ideological battles that we're waging, we have to say, well, how do we humanize this? How do we get people to connect this to someone that they know? and that's tough. All of this is so very important because the people who oppose much of what we believe in are strategic and tactical. And if we're not, like, first of all, if we don't understand that this is even happening, let alone have our own strategies to counter it, in this majoritarian system, we're going to consistently lose. And that matters because if people don't respect our rights, if the majority does not understand where the line is of our life, liberty, and property, they're going to continue encroaching upon it. And so it's very interesting to read. I mean, Sun Tzu's Art of War, right? Reading Saul Alinsky, understanding how these people think and how they operate. Not only can we learn a little bit from them, I think, for how we can act, I think we can also deploy our own counter-strategic measures to try and be more effective, whether that's in conversations on Facebook, in more formal policy work, lobbying up at the Capitol, writing an op-ed. We have to think a bit more tactically. And I think this is something that we can all learn from, be in some ways inspired by, but be smarter about as well.
Okay, this is episode 21, so you can go to societyandthestate.com/21, and I'm going to have a ton of great links that we're going to share on this just because there's so many good resources. But know your enemy.
Indeed, or he will know you first.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.